This is the second segment of the lecture on subjects of international law, dealing with peoples, individuals, corporations, and other international organizations and other bodies. I'm now going to talk about individuals as subjects of international law. Historically, of course, people would say, no, individuals are not subject of international law, that international law was a law of states. But increasingly, there has been a recognition that individuals play a big role in international law, and that they interact with states and other actors in the field of international law. Here, we've made a distinction between individuals as rights holders and individuals as duty holders. Individuals are entitled to rights under international law, and they owe obligations under international law. So what do these distinctions mean? The body of human rights law, of course, is become hugely important in international law in the last decades. It basically arose from virtually nothing. 100 years ago, there was, for all practical purposes, no international human rights law, and there was very, very little even in 1945 when the Charter of the United Nations entered into force after the Second World War. But the body of law has grown enormously, and it occupies a kind of a dual position, because when a human rights treaty is adopted by states, this creates obligations between states. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights can't be ratified by individuals. It's ratified by states, but it creates obligations by states in a sense vis-a-vis each other, more importantly, for individuals. So although the parties to the treaty are not in reality specifying rights that they benefit from in a bilateral or a multilateral sense, what they are doing is specifying rights for others, for individuals. And of course, this is now a very sophisticated and hugely complicated subject. I think that there was a time not that long ago when people thought that the rights holders were in a territory, for example, that the rights were largely reserved for citizens. In fact, they're not. There are a few rights that are in the main treaties and that are tend to be reserved to citizens or have aspects that are particular to citizens. So there's the right to vote is an obvious one. And it's often specified that can be reserved to citizens, although that is increasingly changing as the law evolves and as it develops, so that more and more it's recognized that you may be able to reserve an election for something like the president of the country or the head of state to a citizen, and perhaps the main parliament, that at many levels there should be no restriction, and that citizenship would not be reasonable. It would not be rational. If at the university we were to have a vote on something, it would be absurd for us to say, well, the only people who can vote in the election at the university are citizens. Say, well, that's irrelevant. But then there are many areas where it's also quite irrelevant. Non-citizens in an urban environment, they pay taxes, they pay the council tax, they contribute to the economy, and they're as concerned as citizens about things like the maintenance of the footpaths and the street lights and the parks and so on. So that idea of reserving the human rights to individuals, in parentheses, citizens, is, I think, weakening as time goes by. The other area where there's a tendency to reserve the right to citizens is where we have mobility rights. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights set out certain mobility rights to move freely within the territory of one's own country, it says, and to leave the territory and to return to one's own country. Now that's been interpreted as meaning that one's own country is somewhat larger than a country of which you're the citizen, recognizing the fact that people may have strong attachments to a country, even if for one reason or another they are not entitled or have not obtained or have lost citizenship in the country. It remains one's own country. We have this example recently in the United Kingdom of the young woman who went off to Syria to join the ISIS fighters, where she had a couple of children, and she said she wanted to come back to her home in Britain, where she had been born and raised. And the British government said, well, no, we're going to strip you of your citizenship. Well, legally, they may have been entitled, and they may have had the power to strip her of her citizenship. I think that's being litigated before the courts right now. But she has a human right to return to the UK to the extent that it's her own country. And of course, it has to be her own country. She would have no other. This is where she was born and raised and spent almost all of her life. The other area where we find that we have spoken a little bit about the rights holders. We could spend hours talking about this subject, but there are also duties that are imposed on individuals by international law. Although this is not an important part of human rights law, we do have some human rights treaties that speak about duties. The American Convention on Human Rights speaks about duties owed to the community and so on. And moreover, we have a cognate or related body of law, international criminal law, that's all about basically law creating obligations that individuals must abide by. These are the international crimes. And if you commit the international crime of genocide or of crimes against humanity, international law says that you shall be prosecuted. And so we can say that you have under international law a duty. You owe a duty internationally under international law, even if your own domestic law allows you to do something. If it's prohibited by international law, then you could be punished by international law. And of course, we have the International Criminal Court to do that. A huge step forward in terms of human development. It was preceded by some temporary and very highly targeted tribunals, the Nuremberg Tribunal after the Second World War, and then more recently tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. But in the last not quite 20 years, we've had the International Criminal Court now occupying that important place and underscoring the fact that individuals also owe duties under international law. So now we move away from, we've talked about peoples, talked about individuals. Now I want to say a little bit about international organizations. International organizations being organizations that are created by states rather than by individuals. And that's what makes them international. Of course, we have many types of bodies that are clubs and associations that have members in different parts of the world. And we generally don't think of them as having any presence or engagement in international law, but international organizations or interstate organizations play a very important part. I think the first ones date back not quite 200 years. There were, in Europe, there was a commission. If you ever go to Strasbourg, you can see a building there of the Rhine River Commission, which was the river that divided historically France and Germany, and it was set up to administer a river, traffic on the river, and various issues relating to the river that the states that all shared that river had to contend with. And that's the beginning of international organizations. An important one set up in the middle of the 19th century was the International Postal Union. And it still operates today, and it's still of huge importance globally, because what the Universal International Postal Union means is that you can buy a stamp in London and put it on a postcard and put an address on it anywhere in the world. It can be in a country that's not very friendly with the United Kingdom, like North Korea or Iran, and you'll still get the postcard delivered. And you can do the same thing if you're in North Korea or Iran. You can send your postcard to the United Kingdom and it'll be delivered. And you know, none of the money you've given to buy the stamp is going to go to the postal worker in Iran or North Korea who's going to deliver that letter, but they'll do it. Why? Because we have a treaty and because we have an organization that sees to the implementation and enforcement of the treaty. we often think of international organizations as being there to keep states from fighting with each other, but there's a huge body of international, a huge number of international organizations that are just there to fulfill these functions of smoothing things out, making sure that everything works as our world becomes increasingly international and global. The first attempt at a more political international organization really was the creation of the League of Nations in 1920. It was provided for by the Treaty of Versailles, the treaty with Germany that came at the end of the First World War, and the text was adopted at the end of June of 1919, and it entered into force in the second week, I think, of 2020. And that led then to creation of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations played a role, not unlike the United Nations, although it was clearly a beginning organization, and it never worked, and it was unable really to deal adequately with the political crises that came in the 1930s. And the United Nations, of course, which was created in its wake, rather than simply reviving the League of Nations in 1945 or 1946, the attempt was to create a brand new organization, and the United Nations has been infinitely more successful and plays a very, very big role in the world in so many respects, and not just in terms of maintaining peace and security and preventing war and conflict, but also in promoting human rights and dealing with a huge range of issues. Most recently, a United Nations agency, the World Health Organization. It's a good thing we had it during the COVID crisis. It wasn't able to prevent COVID, but it would have been worse without having an international global body to see to the global health, essentially. International organizations can make treaties. We have a good example recently here in the United Kingdom. This is the Withdrawal Agreement from the European Union. It's a treaty between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and the treaty was agreed to in November of 2019, and it entered into force or became operational early in 2020, and I believe that it goes out of operation in principle at the end of 2020, and then is replaced by, hopefully, other agreements, including a trade agreement. There's a whole body of law and debate about the responsibility of international organizations, because international organizations can do harm. They can be responsible for people who do harm, such as peacekeepers who misbehave. They can owe money. They can do all kinds. They can violate human rights. And I could give examples of all of this happening. One of the difficulties with international organizations is holding them to account. The question is, where can they be held to account? And we can't bring them before the International Court of Justice, because there it's clear the International Court of Justice only deals with states. We can't bring them before the human rights bodies, because the bodies like the European Court of Human Rights are only going to deal with states parties to the European Convention on Human Rights. And very often we can't hold them to account before national courts. Individuals, for example, who are wronged by the act of an international organization, who try to sue the international organization, may encounter a claim from the international organization to have immunity. And most international organizations actually negotiate agreements with the states where they operate to preserve or to enhance and to regulate and govern their immunity from the national courts, to everything from the right of their employees to buy duty-free booze to the protection against being sued like diplomats. And they get it, and the courts recognize it. So this is one of the difficulties, and we've had cases at the European Court of Human Rights where people have argued, but unsuccessfully, that they were entitled to challenge that the state that hosted the international organization had allowed a violation of their rights and that the state, not the international organization, but that the state that hosted it was responsible for a violation. So we've had examples of that, of things, for example, we have in The Hague, we have the International Criminal, in The Hague in the Netherlands, we have the International Criminal Court, we have the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. They detain people. They hold trials in those countries. Does that mean that they're subject to the European Court of Human Rights and the right to be protected against arbitrary detention and the right to be to have a fair trial? Well, so far, the European Court of Human Rights has resisted breaking down that wall that protects the international organization. That might change in the future.